How much work are you having to do to refill the funding each year? Is it a constant cycle, or have you got regular funders? Because I mean, even if you ran a fundraiser and say you raised a number $5 million, $10 million, if that isn't consistently coming in, you don't want to scale and then have to kind of reduce the size of the operation you're doing. I think repeat donors is going to be super important to what you do.
For sure, recurring donors are very valuable to what we do, and we have experienced like this really rapid growth. But our challenge, honestly, has been that we've seen even a much sharper growth in our impact. So let me give you a concrete example on this. So in Uganda, they commit to build this unit. I hire a prosecutor, actually from Texas, who's a 13-year prosecutor, and he built the human trafficking prosecution unit just outside Houston. He and his wife and his 3 girls sell their house, they sell their cars, and they move to Kampala, Uganda to go lead this work. When he first started, I told him, hey, my goal in our first year is to see a 70% increase in the number of traffickers stopped through prosecution. And he looked at me like I had 3 heads. I mean, he said, are you out of your mind? Like the US pilot on which this is based saw a 114% increase over 2 years. 70% is greater than half of that. And that's what you're asking for in 1 year with basically just me versus the entire resource of the federal government. That's insane. And this is all pre-COVID. Mm-hmm. And he said, all right, but I like a challenge, so we'll go in and we'll try. And COVID hit, everything got harder. But by the end of the year, we had seen a 304% increase in enforcement, the number of traffickers stopped. Now, over 2 years, it's a 538% increase over 2 years. I mean, when I was at DOJ and we saw a 114% increase over 2 years, people were going crazy. Like, this is the game changer in trafficking. And now we're talking 538% increase with a much, much smaller investment of resources. So the awesome news about that is, I mean, you're talking 70 to 75% of those victims are children. So those children are now in places where they're starting to be cared for. And now you're talking about almost 1,000 traffickers that are behind bars that aren't going to do this again. Got our first ever life sentence of a trafficker a few months ago. Like, tremendous movement that's happening. The challenge now is when you're talking about a 538% increase instead of a 70% increase, that means there's a lot more cases that need attention. And we have this huge organizational risk. Like, I can't afford to burn out my lead prosecutor, or life happens and his parents get sick or his wife's parents get sick. He has to come back to Texas for 8 months, devastates our impact. And there's a huge advantage to keeping the pedal on the ground, because for traffickers, there's this flywheel effect that if you see a lot of enforcement barreling down at you very, very quickly, seeing big sentences, and it starts to feel like there's zero shot that I'm not going to get caught. And so I'm out. I'm just shifting to voluntary laborers. I'm shifting industries. I'm out. It's too risky. And so driving that deterrent impact depends on speed. And that's where, for us, we're like looking at this. And if I were a for-profit company, I would say it's time to raise a Series B, right? We've got really unbelievable proof of concept. We benchmarked this against the global per capita average. And so Western Europe and the Western Hemisphere, collectively, they're about 1.7x the global average of human trafficking prosecutions. Not surprisingly, they have the most resources, the most expertise. Africa is about 0.9x the global average, lagging a little behind. Uganda, before we showed up, right at 0.9x, very average performer for Africa. After our embedded expert model, Uganda is now performing at almost 9x the global average. So not only are they 9x the global average, they're almost 5x the high performers that we're seeing in the Western Hemisphere and Europe. So we've got proof of concept. What we really need is growth capital. And that's just a less common concept in the nonprofit philanthropic space. But a community like this, a Bitcoin community, like you probably have listeners right now who within 10 minutes could change that. And that's the kind of thing that's quite exciting is you build a revolution, not from the sort of old crusted philanthropic strategies of the past, but you have this global currency that is now looking to solve a global problem to bring global freedom, and that's pretty exciting to me.
There are billionaires who listen to the show. We know that factually.
Yeah.
There are people with considerable wealth. There's always a lot of demand on it, though. There's lots of problems in the world, and I agree with you. Bitcoin is a very generous, and if we can help support you with this would be great. What kind of numbers are game changers for you? You've essentially said you've you've achieved product market fit. You now want to scale. I've got no idea the cost to run. What's the cost now to run the operation at 22?
So our entire organization is operating on a $5 million budget.
Annual.
Okay. Entire organization. So
what's a game changer for you? What kind of number if somebody came and said, I can just give you this?
I mean, we can scale. I mean, 50 million really allows us to scale in a massive way. But even like a $5 million growth capital allows us to scale up in Uganda, build that proof of concept out so that you start to hit funding at scale. So that's really the biggest limiting factor is funding and then building that pipeline of embeds to drive these things forward. And so that's what we're working on.
And you're not just prosecuting traffickers. My assumption is you're saving actual lives.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so
not just, I mean, you're physically saving lives, but you're saving people's future and mentally protecting them. You're protecting families. There must be other secondary effects of this as well.
Yeah, it's actually quite fascinating when you think about it because many of us are already, maybe philanthropically funding other really great efforts. So you send money, for instance, just to Uganda to build great schools. There's literally, a fantastic school in Uganda that's funded philanthropically. There you have an amazing medical clinic and hospital over here. You have economic development and micro enterprise over here. Well, what happens when all those incredibly important humanitarian initiatives are there? And the people that we're funding are there, and they can't actually reach the people that they're trying to serve because those people are literally walled off from all that development and public health intervention by a trafficker, by a brothel wall. What do? You're going to ask the hospital administrator to go take on a trafficker or the school administrator? Like, they can't do that. And so what we find is that trafficking begins to act as this bottleneck that chokes out the efficacy of these very, very important development and public health initiatives that are already in the very places where the trafficking victims are. And so if you can wedge open that bottleneck, there's already a lot of bandwidth there to meet those other needs. And that's one of the reasons why there's this massive study that the World Bank did a while back to look at what's the biggest driver of GDP. And what they found is that the largest predictor of GDP value is rule of law institutions. 57% of the intangible wealth, which makes up the majority of GDP, is driven actually by the effectiveness of rule of law institutions. And when there's not that, when you have those broken public justice systems that aren't actually protecting people from crimes like trafficking, if you're not safe, nothing else matters. And yet, if we can actually wedge open that bottleneck, there's a lot of bandwidth there to address some of those other needs. So in that sense, it becomes an amplifier of these other investments that are too important to languish because we haven't addressed the trafficking problem.
That's a highly relevant point to a lot of discussions we have where people are, we have a lot of libertarians listen to the show, anarcho-capitalists who believe centralized institutions have failed us and they're one of the primary problems in society. I disagree. I recognize there have been failings by governments, there have been failings by institutions, but this is an example of something which, if you don't have centralized forces working on it, it's a problem that's hidden and a problem that I believe would grow. So we fully support you. Are you already raising Bitcoin? Do you have a Bitcoin donation address on your website?
We do, actually.
Okay,
so
great.
I want to give actually a shout out to Alex Holmes and OpenNode, who came alongside and made it really easy for us to launch and make it easy for Bitcoiners to be engaged. And to do so incredibly generously. He just is so moved by the mission that he's really not making any money off this, I think, until there's 10 million Bitcoin donations in the door. So,
dude, I reckon you can twist his arm to never take it.
I imagine that's the case too. And honestly, if we hit 10 million in Bitcoin donations after your show, that's a good problem to have. So,
I mean, you may do, you may not. I mean, there are people listening who can do that in one hit. I wonder if they would. Have you got any idea how much you've raised so far with Bitcoin?
I don't know the exact numbers. We're right on the front end of that. So we'll be at the Bitcoin conference, and then we're trying to engage with the Bitcoin community through podcasts like this and through other folks. And honestly, it seems like it's a kind of community where you could have like a group of influencers that organically says, hey, this is going to be our deal. We're going to kind of own this and figure out like creative ways to harness this to drive this forward. And I think that would be awesome. I think that could be cool.